Welcome to the Cypher Podcast, where we discuss all things sci and paranormal through the lens of remote viewing. I'm your host, Brett Stewart, accompanied by my trusty co-hosts, Emily and David. And today we are discussing the Coral Castle. It's a very interesting architectural feat undertaken by a single individual. And perhaps what's most interesting to me about this is what was not in the data, and that will probably make more sense as we go along here. So thanks for joining me, you two. I'll hand it off to you, Emily, to give us an overview of this subject.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So for those of you who don't know, the Coral Castle is it's not quite a castle. It's more like if you went and visited it, what it would look like is a bit of a park. So it's a series of structures and walls that are built in what looks like a park or a garden in a place called Homestead, Florida. And it was built by a man named Ed Leedskalnin. And he carved large coral rocks and basically placed them into various shapes and patterns, and even made a few sculptures. And it's basically the topic of much speculation in terms of there's a lot of lore around how it was created. Ed himself was a very reclusive and mysterious historical figure, and so there's a lot of lore around that. And there's also a bit of a love story here as well that basically goes, Ed was betrothed to be married to his fiancée. Her name was Agnes. And on their wedding day, Agnes actually stood Ed up, so she didn't show. And he was apparently very heartbroken. He was originally born in Latvia in Europe. And he was so heartbroken, he actually left Latvia and did a bit of a world tour and landed in Florida, where he built this castle. And he claims that he built this castle for his wife that never was. And she was 16 at the time, so he called her his Sweet 16. And famously, I guess the most sort of famous pop culture reference to this would be from Billy Idol. Billy Idol actually wrote a song called Sweet 16, and it was about Ed and Agnes and their love story. And so Ed was a pretty unique character, and I think we're going to go into some of that in the session data. And so it's interesting. Sometimes I want to talk a little bit about this. Sometimes when we assign a task to multiple viewers, we don't quite understand why or how, but it's almost like the viewers subconsciously share the load. So one viewer will go into certain aspects of the topic, and another viewer will go into different aspects of the topic, and they don't necessarily always overlap. But it's a very handy feature for us doing a show on this. So we've actually got some session data from David. David's going to get in a little bit into the mindset, psychology, kind of the motivations and personality of Ed himself, who we believe to be the original constructor of the castle. And then we're going to get into some more of the construction methods with Brett. But why don't you start us off, David, and get into what your session data revealed?
Sure. So in my summary, I said the target is an unanswered mystery regarding a man-made object, which I think is fair because there's a lot of speculation about this. But that while it's in an incongruous place, like you can just find it on the map, it's signposted, it's not a hidden secret thing. We're looking at, why did this happen? What is this about? This is a natural landscape. I got some data on the landscape and the physical aspect in common with Brett, which is interesting. First, I used the word treasure. I even thought for a while maybe this person I'm describing is treasure hunting, or they're seeking something. They had a yearning and a need for something. And I know that word came up in Brett's session too. And also water. And I believe the Coral Castle has been moved, Emily. Is that correct?
That's right. So not only did he build it, which would have been a pretty amazing feat in and of itself, but then he moved it. He found out that for various reasons, we might get into the speculation later, but he basically moved it up the road because he realized it was in the wrong spot. So there was a construction and then kind of a tear down and a reconstruction.
So I say he's in this landscape. There's a desirable thing. And you can find it on a map because there is an attractor here, which is a jargon term that we use for, kind of like a magnet, something which will draw your attention there, which is a regular geometric, upright, man-made structure. So next I get there is a life, which I then contradict myself and say, which appears to be a dead body with chunks missing. Died suddenly, unplanned, unexpected, and he left something undone or not neatly concluded. There's a lack of closure. The story is not finished, lost in mysterious circumstances. So then I moved on to look at this desire. I described it as a desire which went wrong, which I guess could be his Sweet 16. And looking at this in the context of why is he doing it? What's the purpose or mission behind this? And it felt like he wasn't really aware of this, the real subconscious driver behind what he was doing. He hadn't introspected on that and seen what it was about. I got the phrase, if only I could regain or recapture something, like this hankering after the past. And I kind of dropped out of my session for a moment there to say, like just analytically speaking, maybe this desire thing that he's focused on is like a proxy for something unacknowledged or subconscious, a need that is not addressed. So he's maybe using this structure as a stand-in or projecting something onto it. In the past, there was a good state, and it's like a long time ago. There's an arduous, and I use the word ungrounded, an ungrounded mission. He had it and lost it. So overall, this felt like he set his sights on building this thing, kind of oriented himself towards it, set off, and then for a long time he just kind of carried on. He didn't get additional information or reappraise this. I said this is kind of like sailing through fog, but only using your compass. He just couldn't see anything around him. He was just like, I'm going in this direction, and that's it. I've also had a really interesting simile that I've used here, a path through shadows. Only one way forward to the unknown, ungrounded. So it feels like he's really come unstuck, basically. So he has a singular endpoint or goal. He wants to finish, and then he can rest. He'll be satisfied, he's done his bit, and it's time to retire. It's a life's mission or purpose, an obsession. This goal's always been there, even when he was doing other things. I don't know, Emily, did he have a day job or?
I think he was actually quite poor, and he had I think he enjoyed showing off what he'd done. So he gave little guided tours. I think it was 10 cents you would donate to him, and then he would give you a tour and entertain guests and things like that. So that was sort of how he made some money. Obviously he'd have to eat and prepare food for himself and such, but I don't get the feeling he really did a lot else aside from build this castle and live off of the welfare of other people.
Cool. Well, I guess not too much other stuff going on, but I've written that even when he was doing other things, this was always there. This was always the big current carrying him along. So then I'm like, well, this is all well and good, but this is a bit conceptual. So let's look at it in practical terms. And the very first word I wrote was alone. So I said, why was he alone? This was crazy, impossible, improbable. And then I had this idea of like recapturing childhood. He's trying to take himself back to an earlier good state by indulging in this thing. It's just him doing it. Nobody else has this level of commitment to this thing. He's methodical, driven, motivated. He's got staying power, eyes on the prize, if you like. So then you wonder, why would anybody do this crazy thing? What benefit did he imagine that he was going to get from achieving this? I had this little idea of treasure pop into my head again here. But this was more like awareness or wakefulness, or trying to sort of summarize this. I said closure, um, satisfaction of completion, like a personal peace, a sense of resolution, freedom, and release. So these are like the goals of attending therapy and doing your inner work. These are the goals of getting the painful stuff out of your psyche, and he's trying to achieve this by building rocks. I mean, to each their own. You can sit and meditate for 20 years and this stuff will happen on its own eventually. So perhaps this process was even functioning that way for him. It's quite a meditative thing to be out cutting stone on your own all day. I mean, my data don't support that, but I wouldn't regard this as likely to be a very effective therapeutic modality, I think. Be fair to say. So he had like guilt finishing something uncompleted. He feels like he's kind of got everything he needs. Subtly, he also would kind of like the kudos to be known as the guy who built this thing, but that's not what's driving him. Then I looked at the relationship between the landscape and the structure and Ed. So, how does the structure relate to the landscape? It's not supposed to be here. Unusual circumstances leading up to it being here. It was dropped or abandoned or deposited by life moving through this area in the past.
So that might actually be in reference to the original location, where there was this realization that Ed had once he'd completed it, is that, oops, this isn't supposed to be here. And then he let himself undertook the process of moving the entire thing.
How did he determine where it was supposed to be?
Yeah, so the story goes that he moved his creation from one location to another because of something to do with the Earth's energy, ley lines, magnetic field lines. It's not entirely clear. He himself was pretty cagey about the topic, but there's obviously a lot of speculation around this, many theories, but something to do with it didn't feel right energetically to him, and it needed to be moved to a new location.
Well, perhaps we'll have to do another remote viewing project on that in the future to find out. So I did get that he really loved this landscape that he was in, that it felt like a part of him, because being there made him feel on mission. So that's interesting that, he didn't feel okay unless he was in the place that was making him feel like he was reaching his goal. He seemed to be this whole session reminds me of that quote from Carl Jung that is something like, unless you make the unconscious conscious, it will determine your life and you'll call it fate. And it's not exactly that quote, but it seems like he really hadn't made the unconscious conscious. He was being just driven around by stuff that he wasn't really aware of in his own mind. So, other than that, I looked at the ways and means of the origin of the structure. And I said, it feels like it has power, but it might be symbolic power. Like everyone is in agreement with this idea. So, not literal power, more, you know, hey, have you seen the coral castle up the road? The guy who built it used magic or something. And then some more down to earth stuff. It's underground, separate, dedicated area for it, elevated, an unclean or something like unclean area that needs to be kept separate to protect it from others and to protect others from it, and that it's outside. And that's all she wrote on that.
Well, thank you, David. There's some pretty, mostly things that I would have expected, having done quite a bit of research on this topic in there. And I think that's one of the common threads we see in our data is that there's one of the reasons we wanted to do this topic is to do an exploration on a topic where people think there might be a lot of sort of woo going on. There might be some very bizarre things, and certainly there's a lot of lore about this place. But the reality in our data is that it just doesn't bear that out, and there are some very prosaic and very plain explanations for how all this came about.
Well, yeah, I was pleased when I got the feedback for this session that I didn't find any woo because I wasn't super familiar with this. I had seen like an engineer explaining what all the strange things he left behind were and how they thought he'd done it. And that made sense to me. It seemed eminently plausible that this was the horse and not the zebra. I didn't see any need for magic levitating flutes and things to be involved in this process. So yeah, I didn't know anything other than the engineering side of it. So it's been fun to hear about his lost sweetheart and get into the psychology of what was going on here.
Well, I think that leads us very nicely into Brett's session data, where I think we got a lot more information about the actual construction methods and techniques that Ed would have used. Brett, did you want to share some of your findings with
Yes, I
us?
think that is what the majority of my remote viewing data focused on. So I have three different aspects to the work. The first was the actual extraction process itself. The second was the relocation of what was being extracted. And then I just at the very tail end, almost like part of me knew that there was going to be a division of labor here between David and myself. At the very tail end, I got the life form and the life form's relationship to the activity that was taking place. So the first part of my data describes the extraction process. And to paint a picture of the location where I'm at, I'm describing a rather seaside coastal location, which I suppose would match the Florida environment. But the actual extraction, the way I'm describing it, is that there are these blocks that are concretey, really heavy, rather large rectangular blocks that are. It was funny because in the session, I got that there was a kind of growth associated with it, and that even though these are like concrete slab, I actually called them slabs in the work. But what's interesting about the actual extraction is I had them under a few feet of water. And the only thing I can guess of what that meant at this point, and it is just a postulate, is that there is, during the actual extraction itself, water was used. And I think it may have been used in multiple ways, perhaps partly in the manner of separating it from the actual natural landscape. Water, maybe some sort of a water drill or something that, I suppose you use water in drilling, but ultimately it was extracted and fractured off, is the way I described it, from the natural environment. The actual relocation of it, I believe water was also used, but in a slightly different way, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But I was getting some natural aspect of the actual thing itself that was being broken off. And this might be me simply describing the nature or the history of the material itself. If this is a type of limestone, it's something that would be like petrified organic life over time, is what this would actually create. So this is what he actually was extracting. Is that correct, Emily? That's what this is, the type of material he used?
So there are some tools on site that are still evident from the time of construction, and it appears like for the most part, coral rock is very porous and very soft. So interestingly enough, it isn't super heavy like a granite would be. It's relatively speaking light. It is still stone and still has mass, and these blocks are quite large, but it's not as difficult to work with as a very hard stone like granite. And so metal saws could have actually been used to cut it, as far as I understand. Also, if you think about when you're breaking a large rock in half, I don't know if you've ever seen these videos where they do generally drive in sort of chisels along a particular path to get the rock to be cut. And at the moment the rock actually breaks in half, it's almost like a big fracturing process, and there is an explosion like sound or energy as the rock sort of shatters and falls apart, which may correlate with your data there, Brett.
Got it. That makes sense. And so further on in the extraction data, I was describing a man-made tool that was moving back and forth. This is very likely the actual drilling process that was used. It had a strong smell of gasoline as well there, something perhaps like a generator. Maybe this is the drill. But the end result is more what I focused on, is that there was an explosive pressurization that resulted in the separation of these large blocks from the land. And the end result is these objects could then be moved somewhere else.
About the drilling, using water in combination with physical force. Have you ever had that thing where you turn off your bathroom tap and it goes bang in the pipes? It's called water hammer, and it's the inertia of all the water rushing up the pipe to the tap, and when you suddenly cut it off, all that energy just hammers and it can damage your plumbing. It carries a lot of force because water is not compressible particularly. So you can definitely use water as part of because it is theorized to have been a very low-tech process that he was employing. Um, but yeah, you can put water in something and then hammer the water, and you're going to move the force through the water into whatever you're cutting, and push fissures open, that sort of thing. I think perhaps somebody in the oil and gas industry will send me an angry letter now, but that would make
That's
sense.
exactly what I was getting the impression of, is you have a large piece and then at just the right points, there was enough drilling or pressure, however it was, that the whole thing would just kind of snap. And it was an explosive outcome as a result. I did have quite a bit of debris that also appeared to just be everywhere at the site, which imagine if you're doing this by hand and some sort and you're dealing with this, there would be a lot of dust and grime and soot. And I was really getting it was really kind of a messy process. Question that if someone would read about this story and is how in the world do you move a block of this kind of size into a very precise location? And I got that there were two primary elements used in the actual relocation of these blocks. The very first one, well, actually, both of these are very simple. They're not complex at all. There's no magic going on here. Maybe just some ingenuity. But the first one is I described something that looked like a railroad track that could be movable, and I had an analogy of how Egyptians would move large obelisks. And so there would be these rolling pins underneath the block, and as it was moved across these pins, the back pins would kind of leapfrog to the front, and then it would just keep rolling along these pins. So that does appear to be part of how these things were moved, but it still begs the question, how do you get an enormous block out of the ground in the first place? Well, I think the answer there in my remote viewing data, this had to do with probably the water, why there was so much water here that not only David got, but I got, is I believe that water, I had this stand that was a peaked V-like stand, and there were elements hanging down. And I think that what was going on is I had these tubes. I'm pretty sure they were water hoses, and drainage and the filling up of water was used as a way to counterbalance these large blocks. Because what I described is that it's like rolling these things downhill, is that the motion or movement of these things was promulgated by understanding gravity really well. And so it's like you just push it with your finger, and the thing, because it's balanced so well, I believe the counterbalance was the water used in these tubes to get it there, is what would have allowed the ability to actually move these things from one place to another on some sort of a pulley system. So it's ultimately a track. And then secondly, mechanics were driven by gravity, almost like you could just push it downhill.
So there definitely is photographic evidence of Ed using what appears to be a giant tripod, or a series of giant tripods, a series of pulleys, and there was a particular type of device or mechanical box at the peak of the tripod, which had chains and pulleys, some sort of electricity there. There were no pictures or photographic evidence of pipes or water, but it does make sense that water could in some way be used, I guess, as a counterbalance or a counterweight. But definitely, Ed seemed to have mastered basic Newtonian physics using pulleys and levers and these sorts of things. And I should mention that Ed himself was a stonemason. I believe his father also was a stonemason. So this wasn't just some random person who seemed to be able to do these miraculous things. He actually had lifelong training in working with stone and actually moving extremely large trees. He did logging for a while. There's photos of him with just these massive logs that are the size of a house, and how they get moved. He did have a lot of technical competence when it came to moving things that are very heavy, that didn't involve his personal strength or body weight. It was all a matter of just clever physics.
That's exactly what my work described. Is it seemed like clever physics. It's gravity driven. There's no huge exertion of lifting these things. It's just balancing them very well, and then they moved like you push it with your finger, and it just moved.
I've just been looking on people's photos they've put up on Google Maps, and there is a large pool of water at the site. So perhaps this is where He's accumulating, storing the water that is being moved about for this purpose. There's also a few kind of trough and cistern-looking things, although, those would be about the right size to wash your dishes in rather than counterbalance these huge blocks. But there's a large pool there that would hold a significant volume of water. I mean, whether this was there at the time of construction, I don't know, because it's a museum now. It's got a gift shop and everything.
Yeah, and ultimately, like the actual work just describes the filling up and then the drainage of water is part of the moving. So my postulate is ultimately that it was used as a counterbalancing type of thing due to the nature way that would work. How the exact way he did it, I only can really say what my data describes, that was a piece of it. But it did seem to me that the actual activity of doing it though was risky business. That was something that when I was describing it, I'm like, you could really easily get crushed if you were in the wrong place and standing at the wrong angle when these things were moving, that it would be really dangerous and you'd have bodily harm. So I just got this aesthetic impact for myself in the session that I was like, oh dear, I would want to make sure I wasn't in the too close to this thing as it was moving, or it would smash me like a potato under a car of a wheel or something like that. So a lot of this though was ultimately centering something, and I described it as these things were moved very precisely into an inlay that seemed to be prepared for them in advance. There was an inlay or groove where as soon as it was moved, it just was set very neatly exactly where it was intended to go. The process overall, though, I described as a very prolonged event. It was episodic. This is a 725 episode TV series of let's move the blocks and cut them. It seemed to take a very long time. So if it took him several decades to get this done, that's exactly matches the RV impressions I was getting in my work.
I just had a look at some more of the photos, and there's two pictures of what appear to be wells cut down below the water table, which is quite shallow in this location. I guess it's low-lying, it's coastal. So he's built means to extract the groundwater here. I mean, obviously he would want some to drink, but
Water would actually be one of the most logical counterweights because it's easy to move. Like the units are you can divide water as much as you need to actually get the perfect counterweight. And if you pipe it through somewhere, it's very easy to fill up. I'd imagine a series of barrels or something like that to get the perfect counterweight. You don't have to physically carry it. You just have to have a pump, and you could slowly over time pump the counterweight in to create this. There's not a lot of physical exertion. So I think that Ed was also a very relatively small man. He was small in stature and in weight, and he wasn't sort of like this big muscled individual. He was a fairly small individual, and so I think he used his wit more than his brawn to move some of these stones around.
Yeah, that's what it seemed like. So anyway, the final aspect of my data just kind of piggybacks a little bit on what David got in his work of looking into who this person was that was doing it. It was almost like an afterthought in my session. It was like, oh yeah, and by the way, there's also this data about the individual doing it. But the impressions that I got from this person was that he was feeling a great deal of despair and sadness as he was doing this process. And so now understanding the history of it, I suppose if you built something for the person or as a result of trying to handle the trauma of your love of your life decide not to marry you, that seems to have stuck with him during this entire building process. He had the feelings of a strong sense of loss, and so that seems to match the known records of this individual. But as he was building this, and as he was lifting these blocks into place, and as he was creating this structure, I did describe that he viewed this as his treasure. When he got these things out of the ground and he put them into place, it was like gold to him. It was he rather would have this than have gold. That's the way he viewed them. And so it was a way for him to hold on to something valuable. And maybe that was the memory of something he had before. I can't be quite sure, but it was the general impression I had of Ed. The final piece of data that I had under this is the entire construction itself. To me, it was an analogy, but in his own eyes, it came across the whole place was kind of like a funeral pyre. That is what is a funeral pyre? It's a way to send somebody else off into the next life. And perhaps that's tying a little bit into the backstory of maybe him building this castle was a way to finally let go or send that that relationship into the beyond. And that's the way I described his relationship. So that's about all I had.
Yeah, I had that he was seeking closure and freedom and release from this, so that would be super consistent with that. And he died before he finished it as well. Um, I very pithily said, missed the target, didn't make it, sad, the end. And that is at the end of my summary.
It does sound a bit like he was grieving the loss of his love that never was, and that he was sort of trying to deal with the unhealed trauma that entailed in his life.
Now, Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a tremendous amount of storytelling on the internet about this subject where people believe Ed used magic or Egyptian magical techniques with sound and all of these things that there's no evidence for. It's David was making a little flute motion or the magic sound flutes. And I believe there's a lot of that out there. And tying just back into what I said at the beginning of the show, that perhaps one of the most interesting things about our work is what's not in it. Is that, we're more than adept and happy to look at paranormal things. It's one of the purposes of the show is how do we look at paranormal things with a critical eye and still stay grounded, but still be open-minded enough to explore them through the lens of remote viewing, something that we've spent many years practicing, cultivating. But that's not here. This is all just really simple mechanics, some drilling with water, moving large, heavy blocks, possibly with counterbalancing weights using water, and then the story of rather a sad story about a man who lost something that was really dear to him. We're missing the magic, though.
Right. So I have a theory on where that might have come from. Ed famously, allegedly said that he had uncovered or discovered the secrets of the pyramids and how the pyramids were built. And obviously, there's a ton of speculation on how the pyramids were built. And so people project, I think, into Ed's construction mechanisms the fact, well, first of all, we don't know that he accurately does know how the pyramids were built. That's number one. And number two, the mysticism from the pyramids then gets kind of projected into his construction, which maybe he wanted for his
it was
fame.
funny, even in my session, I had the analogy of the way that this is being moved, these large blocks, is similar or akin to how Egyptians would have moved a large obelisk, which is on its side with rolling pins. Not a lot of there's not a lot of magic in that other than just a basic understanding of how to roll something along the ground, right?
I think another thing which attracts woo-woo interpretations is that it is a mystery still. When you look at the forms, the kind of artistic expression of it, it's a strange and unclear thing. And perhaps we've been able to uncover the meaning behind it with our remote viewing work, but that's not apparent if you go and look at that structure. It's a very strange and mysterious thing, and what happens around strange and mysterious constructions? Obviously magic. And levitating flutes and Egyptian, I don't know, but no magic
At least
here.
according to our RV data.
There is one element of this space that I should mention that is a bit strange. There is a giant door at the entrance to I don't think it's the entrance to the current park or museum that's there, but there's a giant door to the entrance to the original park, and it's many tons. And it was balanced at the time it was built such that you could open it with a finger. This is perfectly counterbalanced. And at one point in time, apparently it broke. And they called a team of engineers from the local university in to look at it and to try to fix it. And even with modern computer modeling, laser technology, they struggled to rebalance it. Now, there's a few theories I have on why and how he might have originally done it. David, do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't think we should give modern engineering too much credit as having all the answers. Um, in Well, a long time ago, I was an archaeologist, and here in the UK, in the Iron Age, a couple of thousand years ago plus, the the construction techniques were building roundhouses with upright wooden posts in a circle, and then a roof going to a central point above that. And there was a reconstruction of an Iron Age settlement, a hill fort, where people wanted to rebuild these houses. And they actually did like a TV show where modern people went to try and live this Iron Age lifestyle. And I'm not sure, I didn't watch the show, but because they were filming there, they had to get like the safety inspectors to come. And these things have survived storms. They're absolutely rock solid, just based on what a bunch of archaeologists made from inferring the structure from looking at some holes in the ground. Because obviously the wood's long gone. All you can see is the holes that the posts were put in, and then they've got to make the rest up as they go along. So these structures, really solid. I would sleep in one. And the safety inspector, engineering, structural engineer, whatever he was, guy came along with his computer model and said, "This is impossible. This has fallen over already. This could never stand up. It doesn't work." And it's like, well, look at it. It's your model that's wrong here. This works fine. So the engineering approach is not guaranteed to cope with things which have been made by human intuition.
Right. I think there's definitely some skills that have been lost to time. Perhaps previous generations, when it came to some of these things, had certain techniques and skills that people, even university educated people in our modern times, simply don't have. And to me, my theory, at least, on how this gate could have been constructed is Ed could have taken a block that was roughly speaking balanced, drilled a hole roughly in the center, and then just chipped away at the edges until he balanced it. He had a lot of patience and a lot of dedication. It would be seemingly impossible to someone who isn't as focused and dedicated in our modern time. But if you have a year to chip away at a rock very patiently, you could probably work out how to balance it on its center of gravity.
I mean, I'm familiar with that swinging door thing, and that is exactly how I would do it. I don't think it's rocket science. I don't think it's even difficult. I think most people could do that if they had Ed's experience, because remember, he's spent his whole life working with this material. He has an incredible intuitive grasp of moving it about with balance, right? He can feel this like a musician feels their instrument. He's intimately familiar with the medium that he's working in. So I think it is going to be really quite straightforward for him to do that. And why drill a hole roughly through the center? You don't need complex measuring tools to drill a hole through a square block. You just need a couple of bits of string and a pencil and a drill bit. It's not rocket surgery in any way to do this. I don't find the swinging door to be suggestive of the requirement for any kind of high science or technology or magic. It's a rock that's balanced. People have been able to do that with hand tools since people have had hand tools. It's not a mystery in my book. Sorry to poo-poo the anybody was hoping one last hope for some Egyptian levitating flutes, but no. Interesting rock.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of machinery that's there. So Ed claims to have had advanced knowledge in electricity, magnetism. Now, this would have all been information that he got sort of through informal education. As far as anyone can tell, he didn't have formal training in electricity, magnetism, and engineering. It was the turn of the century, early 1900s, and back then electricity was still rather mysterious. So even if he had some things that would be at the level of, say, a high school science fair experiment, back then would have seemed pretty mystical and magical. He may have found that to be quite special. There was a flywheel, a giant flywheel, that is speculated to have driven a lot of his cutting tools and machines, and maybe even pumps, in the main structure or house. And interestingly enough, it had 16 spokes or cogs in the wheel. And many times he was quoted as saying he's waiting on his sweet 16. Now, that could have a double meaning. Maybe he was waiting on Agnes, his long-lost love, or maybe he was waiting on his 16-wheeled machine, which apparently he did, or 16, spoked machine, which apparently he was very enamored with. He was quite proud of his own creation. So he did build lots of mechanical gadgetry. He did have some knowledge of batteries, some knowledge of magnetism, electric motors, things like this. And that's the evidence for that is still in the space. It's still there on site.
I believe the 16 spoked thing. I watched the video you sent me, Emily, about this, and I think it was basically an alternator, wasn't it? It was made from parts of was it even a Ford Model T or something? It was made from car parts. And this thing was basically rotating round and giving out a pulsing electrical signal. So it was kind of switching things on and off in a pulsed way. And he was using solenoids to lift a saw or some tool. So it would lift up and then drop down repeatedly. So this thing was providing that on, off, up, down motion. And then he was distributing that around the area to where he had the tool set up.
Again, I think the recurring theme here is Ed seemed to work smarter, not harder, and he had a lot of patience and a lot of dedication. It's amazing what someone can accomplish when there's no distractions. That he lived by himself, basically in the woods, for decades, without the distractions of our modern life. There's a lot you can get up to in a lifetime of effort.
Photos of this thing, it does look quite mysterious. That's not modern technology, of course, and it is cobbled together, but I found that description compelling, and I know a little bit about electronics, and it made sense to me at the face of it. It's all very plausible and elegant. It's nice. He's come up with an elegant, robust solution there that works. So more power to Ed.
Yeah, so I just want to remind the listener that we're not always going to find something mysterious or magical in our searches. We will very likely, if we feel it's just a prosaic or ordinary explanation for something, we're going to tell you. We aren't going to pull any punches in that regard.
I think we are really doing is we're reporting on what we're perceiving, and take it or leave it. Sometimes our findings are not going to align with the extraordinary tales.
While it was an amazing achievement for one person without using any magic or technology, I think we could also look at this from a different perspective and say it's amazing the impact that your unhealed trauma can have, and the power of the subconscious mind to dictate how your life
So I
pans
think
out.
with that will wrap up this episode of the Cypher Podcast. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this adventure into the realm of, non-really paranormal this time around, but join us next time, since I'm sure Emily will have chosen another interesting task for us to take a look at and do a deep dive on. If you would like to follow up with us and either join our free members or we have after hours shows as well that we do for these subjects, you can find us in the link below or go to remoteviewingpodcast.com or cypher.com. Both work. And I think that wraps it up. So thank you all for being here. We'll see you next time on the Cypher Podcast. Take care.